sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia in order to secure a Greek victory against Troy. So Agamemnon, the dramatist tells us, rather than retreat, endured to offer up his daughter's life to help a war fought for a faithless wife and pay the ransom for a storm-bound fleet. The chorus sets the scene and notes a prophecy that invokes justice, and we'll be talking a little bit about justice later on. It says, the scale of justice falls in equity, the killer will be killed. Now, the sacrifice of Iphigenia activates one kind of revenge, even though it places Agamemnon in an impossible position. If he does nothing, then the war against Troy is going to be lost, but the price of victory is going to be the death of his daughter. Now, alongside this revenge pattern is another, involving Aegisthus, Clytemnestra's lover, who's persuaded that the death of Agamemnon enacts divine justice in that his blood pays in full atonement for his father's treacherous crime. And this is what Aegisthus says. He says, here's the story plain. There was dispute between Atreus, Agamemnon's father, who ruled Argos then, and my father Thyestes, his own brother, whom Atreus drove out from home and city. He came back, sat as a piteous supplement at Atreus' hearth, gained his request in part. His own blood did not stain his childhood's home, but Atreus, this man's father, gave his guest, my father, a host's gift, a gift more full of eagerness and love. He feigned a feasting day, and amidst lavish meats, served him his own son's flesh. Now, a similar episode, of course, informs Shakespeare's Roman tragedy, Titus Andronicus, where Titus serves up Tamara's sons, Demetrius and Chiron, as a pie in revenge for her violent treatment of the Andronici, and especially for the rape of Titus's daughter, Lavinia. Also, the ancient grudge that's between Atreus and Thyestes reappears as the starting point of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, and as we shall see, is a springboard for Hamlet, and in a rather more sophisticated way, Othello. And these are the two plays that I want to talk about and to contrast later on. But I want to take two other classical examples as well before I move on. First, Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, in which the eponymous hero does all he can to avoid a prophecy of the gods that he's going to kill his father and marry his mother. Tragically, everything he does drives him to do what he'd sought to avoid. And in the aftermath, he exacts justice on himself by stabbing himself in his eyes. My second classical example is Euripides' Medea, in which the eponymous heroine seeks revenge on her unfaithful husband by killing her children. Now, in all these plays, taken from different historical moments in which tragedy flourished in the ancient world, we've got the seeds of what were to become various elements of Elizabethan and Jacobean tragedy. Each of these plays, along with a number of other subjects, a number of others, I should say, became the subject of plays by the Roman playwright Seneca, who was writing in 4 BC to 65 AD. And in 1581, his plays were translated into English and collected by Thomas Newton in Seneca, His 10 Tragedies. Now, the emphasis in Seneca was on the intensification of violence, the supernatural, and revenge, among other things. And these are features of one of the earliest Elizabethan revenge plays, Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy in 1587. Now, certain features associated with the act of revenge appear in various degrees in all of these plays. Violations of law and the concern with justice, upsurges of extreme violent energy, lapses into madness, the extent to which the act of revenge in some way pollutes the quest of the revenger, and the tension between human action and forces that appear to be outwith the control of human agents. Ancient Greek tragedy was closely connected with the fortunes of the Greek city-state and values that distinguished its citizens from its barbarian adversaries. Now, this sociological focus emerges in the Elizabethan period at a time of political upheaval when many of the issues that appeared in Greek and Roman tragedy were susceptible to reinterpretation and reappropriation in the light of Elizabethan social, cultural, and political pressures. Now, ancient Greece and Rome provided a wealth of cultural, theatrical, and political history that could offer models for early modern thinkers. Now, this is perhaps a way of a shorthand way of telescoping what on closer examination would turn out to be very complex histories indeed. However, we should perhaps start by asking the question, why should revenge tragedy, or perhaps tragedy that included elements of revenge, appear in England at this particular historical moment? Now, two answers to this question immediately come to mind. The first has to do with justice and the law. In both the Spanish tragedy and in Titus Andronicus, law is shown to be dysfunctional. Hieronymo, the knight marshal, laments his inability to secure justice for his murdered son, Horatio. This is what he says. He says, "Thus must we toil in other men's extremes that know not how to remedy our own, and do them justice when unjustly we, for all our wrongs, can compass no redress." Now, this is also the extreme to which Titus Andronicus is driven in Shakespeare's play. After suffering the loss of his sons and the rape of his daughter Lavinia, he thinks to appeal to the gods for justice and asks his kinsmen, Caius and Sempronius, to deliver messages to the gods with their bows and arrows, but to no avail. He says, "Terras Astrea reliquit." Astrea, god of justice, has left the earth. "She's gone, she's fled, sirs. Take your tools. You, cousins, shall sound the ocean and cast your nets. Happily you may catch her in the sea. Yet there's as little justice as at land." Both Hieronymo and Titus effectively go mad. They can't take the strain. And in their respective madnesses, they commit extreme acts of revenge that exemplify what the philosopher-statesman Sir Francis Bacon called wild justice. Now, what's at issue here is a dysfunctional law that can't deliver justice for a crime committed secretly, or for which no immediate public redress is possible. Justice in the form of punishment for crime may be delivered at the end, but at a price. The violence necessarily consumes the revenger, and he becomes part of the polluted world that, of course, he tries to rectify. Now, the second answer, the second question, is a little more complicated. And I want to refer here to Linda Woodbridge's book, English Revenge Drama, Money, Resistance, Equality, which was published in 2010, where she draws our attention to a renewed awareness of the links between the language of economics, in the restricted disciplinary sense of the term, and the domestic and political affairs of the household or the state. In doing so, she enlarges what has been for far too long generally regarded as a restricted field of inquiry. Indeed, she argues that, quote, "just as merchants sought not debit-credit parity, but a profit, revengers sought not a tie game, but victory. The mental ledger provides a yardstick for measuring triumph," unquote. Now, Woodbridge's concern is with a two-way displacement of a chord of meaning. The balance demanded of revenge shares a fundamental structure with the various economic operations whose practices and pressures were emerging at the end of the 16th century. The failures of law, the absence of justice, the uncontrollability of human passions, the price to be paid for violating order, or the restoration of balance, all come within what we might call an economy. And all these elements find their way in combination in what we call revenge tragedy. Now, let me now turn to the two Shakespeare plays that deal innovatively with the issue of revenge. Now, we know from the very beginning that Hamlet is a play about revenge. By Act 1, Scene 4, we know that something is rotten in the state of Denmark. And in the following scene, the ghost exhorts Hamlet to revenge his foul and most unnatural murder. In the play, a sequence of revenges follow, all of which are stimulated by the regicide of Claudius, or contingent upon the historical events surrounding old Hamlet. We think of Fortinbras's invasions, for example, or indeed the rash actions of Hamlet himself as the play develops. Now, unlike Hamlet, Othello, on the other hand, is a play that we don't think of primarily as a revenge tragedy, although on the eve of the destruction of the Turkish fleet off Cyprus, an enlarged discourse involving economics is deployed metaphorically in Othello's address to Desdemona that will be tested to the full later in the play. Here, love is an exchange. It's a transaction, and it's a transaction that produces profit, an excess of value for the participants. Othello says, "Come, my dear love, the purchase made, the fruits are to ensue, the profits yet to come between me and you." Now, I will argue, or I want to argue, that the multiple revenges at the heart of Othello, although they are the products of imaginative excess, are substantially different from Hamlet in the ways in which they are developed. So let me first turn to Hamlet. Hamlet, as I've said, is about revenge, although, of course, I don't think it would be very difficult to say that it's also about much more. Prince of Denmark has returned from Wittenberg to attend his father's funeral and the marriage of his mother to his uncle Claudius. Freudians have seen in this a family romance, making of the play in part a domestic tragedy, although what happens in the Hamlet family spills over into the political realm of the state of Denmark. And this is something that we need to think about in relation virtually to all of Shakespeare's tragedies. Wittenberg is the place of Martin Luther and the beginning of what was to become Protestantism. But in a more popular sense, it's also where Marlowe's eponymous figure, Dr. Faustus, was educated. Of riper years to Württemberg he went, says the chorus of Marlowe's play. Hamlet's education, then, was in the Protestant Wittenberg, whereas the ghost of his father, who's also named Hamlet, by the way, comes from Purgatory. Purgatory was a Catholic place, so it's a Catholic purgatory. Horatio observes that the appearance of the ghost is wondrous strange, and Hamlet's response is, "And therefore, as a stranger, give it welcome." Now, the ghost is a stranger, but his account of Claudius's regicide and the transgression of his most seeming virtuous queen gives some shape to the unease that Hamlet has felt and articulated in Act 1, Scene 2 of the play. In late Elizabethan England, strangers were not enthusiastically welcome, and we will later discover, nor were they in Shakespeare's Venice. What's important to register at this stage is that there's some doubt about the ghost's veracity. Stephen Greenblatt, in a very famous book, Hamlet and Purgatory, the first edition of which was 2001, takes the view that the ghost's provenance is classical rather than Catholic. He says, "No one, even amongst the most rabid Puritan anti-theatricalists, could imagine them, ghosts, to be secret agents for the Pope's purgatory. Indeed, it's true that ghosts appear in Aeschylus, ghosts appear in Euripides, ghosts appear in Seneca and in Kyd. But Hamlet's education, the recurring doubts about death, and the operations of Providence all suggest that a popular audience would have made the connection with different competing branches of Christianity: Catholicism, Protestantism. Indeed, this ghost complains that he's been cut off in the blossoms of my sins, unhouselled, disappointed, unannealed. That is to say, without having taken the sacrament, unprepared for death, and without having taken the extreme unction or the special sacrament for dying. Now, before the ghost has spoken, Hamlet's uncertain about its origins. Be thou a spirit of health or goblin damned, bring with the airs from heaven or blasts from hell, be thy intent wicked or charitable, thou comest in such a questionable shape that I will speak to thee. After he's spoken with a ghost, he notes, it is an honest ghost, that let me tell you. And the ghost urges him to revenge his foul and most unnatural murder. But his final words, and these are quite important to him, are adieu, adieu, remember me. Now, to this extent, many critics have observed that Hamlet is a memory play. The spiritual emissary from a Catholic past wishes to be remembered as an incentive to action in the present. And this is to be set against Claudius's extremely selective memory of the past that emerges from his first appearance in the play. The green memory of his brother's death produces psychological conflict. Yet so far hath discretion fought with nature, that we with wisest sorrow think on him together with remembrance of ourselves. This selective power of recall gives way a little later to a crucial lapse of memory as Claudius seeks to excuse the death of old Hamlet, which is, he claims, a fault to heaven, a fault against the dead, a fault to nature, to reason most absurd, whose common theme is death of fathers, and who still hath cried from the first corpse till he that died today, this must be so. Of course, the first corpse was not a natural death. In Genesis, it was Cain's murder of Abel in the Garden of Eden. And there are other lapses of memory in Denmark. We might say that Gertrude quickly forgets old Hamlet, and her son has to remind her in no uncertain terms later in Act 3, Scene 4. And even there, even after her conscience has been awakened, she retains a residual forgetfulness. When Hamlet tells her that he's got to go to England, her response is, alack, I had forgot. 'Tis so concluded on. And this forgetfulness extends beyond Hamlet's own domestic sphere. For example, earlier in Act 2, Scene 1, when Polonius is instructing Reynaldo in the business of spying on his son Laertes in Paris, he forgets his lines. This is not simply a question of an actor drying on stage. Rather, it's symptomatic of a wider social unease that's afflicted Denmark along with the poisoning of old Hamlet's ear. And then, sir, says Polonius, does this and does, and he stops. And he says, what was I about to say? By the mass, I was about to say something. Where did I leave? Not only is this a failure of memory, but it's also a point where momentarily the blank verse breaks down. And we need to be very careful how we deal with moments like this in Shakespeare. There's another one in Othello in relation to Brabantio. We'll later find out how important an instrument of memory language is, when after Polonius' death, the entrance of the rebellious revenger, his son Laertes, is announced by the anonymous gentleman. The gentleman says, and this is in Act 4, Scene 5, the ocean, overpeering of his list, eats not the flats with more impetuous haste than young Laertes, in a riotous head, or bears your officers. The rabble call him lord, and as the world were now but to begin, antiquity forgot, custom not known, the ratifiers and props of every word, they cry, choose we Laertes. Laertes shall be king. Now, this concise association of language with the past, antiquity forgot, and with custom and practice, reinforces the dilemma that Hamlet faces. As a result of Claudius's regicide, language is, to put it crudely, separated from reality. Words have no purchase on truth or on the history and custom that supports it, nor do they have any performative value. At a psychological level, the result is forgetfulness. But in terms of the public political world, their devaluation makes action impossible. And this is the major dilemma that Hamlet faces. Until he can make sense of what confronts him, then he can't carry out the ghost's command. And this is what seems to disturb him most. In contrast, the professional player who appears in the play, without motive, can, in a dream of passion, as he puts it, as Hamlet puts it, I should say, force his soul so to his own conceit that from her working all the visage wan, tears in his eyes, distraction in his aspect, a broken voice, and all his whole function suiting with forms to his conceit. And all for nothing. For Hecuba? What's Hecuba to him? Or he to her, that he should weep for her? Now, the classical example, I should say, is part of the consummate actor's repertoire, and it allows Hamlet to reflect on the nature and the purpose of impersonation and acting. But even though Hamlet is, he says, prompted to my revenge by heaven and hell, yet he must, and the metaphor is important here, he must, like a whore, unpack my heart with words and fall a-cursing like a very drab. Now, at the heart of Hamlet's dilemma, as I suggest, is a crisis about language and all that it sustains and all that Claudius's regicide has provoked. Little wonder that Hamlet should be disturbed, although we should be careful not to rush to the judgment that he's been driven mad in the way that either Hieronymo or Titus Andronicus are. Unlike these earlier revengers, Hamlet proposes to use madness as a cover. He says, how strange or odd so may I bear myself, as I perchance hereafter shall think meet, to put an antic disposition on. He's going to act the madman, but he is not mad. He is mad, if you like, in craft. In the play, real madness is displaced onto Ophelia, whose entire life is destroyed by her father's death and Hamlet's evident rejection of her. Ophelia offers us an example of the ways in which particular facets of the plot are displaced onto other dramatist personae. And this is also the case with the question of revenge. If we look closely at the multiplicity of revenges in the play, we'll see more clearly why Hamlet is prevented from acting straight away, even though there are occasions when he may want to. Now, these complications and the tensions they generate are additions that Shakespeare makes to what was fast becoming a theatrical discourse of revenge. The obvious comparison in terms of revenge is that between Hamlet and Laertes, although we could argue that there are others also in the play. For example, young Fortinbras seems to be engaged in a revenge for his father's death at the hands of old Hamlet, while the player enacts the revenge of Pyrrhus, the son of Achilles, upon Priam for the death of his father. In each case, it's the death of a father that occasions a passionate and violent response. But it's only in the case of Laertes that we're given a full account of what we might call the ethics of revenge. Before his appearance in Act 4, Scene 5, we witness the display of Ophelia's madness. Laertes' imminent arrival is announced, and he refuses to be calm. He says, the drop of blood that's calm proclaims me bastard, cries cuckold to my father, brands the harlot, even here between the chaste, unsmirched brow of my true mother. Now, we've no clear evidence of the backstory of Claudius's courtship of Gertrude. Laertes' insinuations may be very suggestive here. But, and this is an important proviso, Hamlet's and Laertes' predicaments are not identical. For example, in the first printed quarto of the play of 1603, after the confrontation with Laertes in Ophelia's grave, and before the entrance of Osric at Act 5, Scene 2, Hamlet makes an important distinction between himself and Laertes that does not appear in the second quarto of 1605, and which reappears only in emended form in the folio 1623. This is the first quarto reading. Hamlet says, "Believe me, it grieves me much, Horatio, that to Laertes I forgot myself, for by myself methinks I feel his grief, though there's a difference in each other's wrong." a difference in each other's role. And this is the folio version, which is a slightly cleaned up version. But I'm very sorry, good Horatio, that to Laertes I forgot myself, for by the image of my cause I see the portraiture of his. I'll count his favours, but sure the bravery of his grief did put me into a towering passion. In other words, he selects an element of Laertes' grief here rather than makes the distinction. Now, Hamlet, of course, forgets himself on two other occasions in the play. When he violates the ghost's injunction not to harm his mother, and he's reminded of his obligation, and then when in a fit of impetuosity, thinking that it's Claudius behind the arrest, he stabs Polonius. Now here in Act 5, Laertes' situation mirrors, i.e. is the image of Hamlet's, although it's in Q1 that the specific distinction omitted in Q2, modified in F, is made. It's worth pausing over two moments in the encounter between Laertes and Claudius. Queen seeks to calm Laertes. She's done this with Hamlet in Act 1, Scene 2, you remember, when he enters. But when that fails, Claudius invokes a force, a superhuman force, that, on reflection, is manifestly ideological. He says, what is the cause, Laertes, that thy rebellion looks so giant-like? Let him go, Gertrude. Do not fear our person. There's such divinity doth hedge a king, that treason can but peep to what it would, acts little of his will. Now, when we think about it, this is, of course, nonsense, since politically powerful though it may be, it didn't protect the legitimate king, old Hamlet. 'Tis, however, of such immediate rhetorical power that it can blunt Laertes' initial intention, which is to engineer chaos. This is what Laertes plans to do. How came he dead? I'll not be juggled with. To hell allegiance, vows to the blackest devil, conscience and grace to the profoundest pit, I dare damnation. To this point I stand, that both the worlds I give to negligence, let come what come, only I'll be revenged most thoroughly for my father. Now, we should perhaps compare this outburst to what Hamlet says to his mother earlier in Act 3, Scene 4, where he accuses her of immodesty, of calling virtue hypocrite, and of taking, as he says, off the rose from the fair forehead of an innocent love, and sets a blister there, makes marriage vows as false as dice oaths, or such a deed as from the body of contraction plucks the very soul, and sweet religion makes a rhapsody of words. The harlot's words that violate the oaths of marriage, an image that Hamlet shares with Claudius, and the whole panoply of religion are violated by Gertrude's actions. Laertes proposes an action that is rebellious and comparable to what Hamlet accuses his mother of perpetrating. In all of these examples, we can begin to see a little more clearly what Hamlet's problem is. He's deprived of the means of justifying an action, any action, in a world that has become chaotic, where the pivotal instrument of language cannot be fashioned in such a way that would justify the action to which he's committed himself. Remembering the ghost takes a real effort in the duplicitous world that Claudius has created. Now, the damage done to Denmark by Claudius is crystallized in a particular moment in the play. Following the ambiguous outcome of the mousetrap, where the king does not openly declare his public guilt, and just after he's made plans to dispatch Hamlet to England with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Claudius is left to consider his position. With a clarity he is deliberately rejected when he first appears, he admits initially to himself that his offence hath the primal eldest curse upon it. This is where he identifies with Cain. He tries to pray, but he can't, because he refuses to give up the fruits of his regicide. And he appeals to heaven. Help, angels, make assay, Bow stubborn knees and heart with strings of steel. Be soft as sinews of the newborn babe. All may be well. At this point, Hamlet enters and sees Claudius in the appearance of prayer. And this prompts a speculation on the nature of what would be an orthodox revenge. But if Claudius is actually praying, then to kill him would be while he is fit and seasoned for his passage. In other words, he's ready to go to heaven. Now, at this point, Hamlet reflects that he needs to kill Claudius when he's actually revealed publicly to be involved in some or any of the consequences of his crime. He says, "Up sword, and know thou a more horrid hint. When he is drunk, asleep, or in his rage, or in the incestuous pleasure of his bed, at game of swearing, or about some act that hath no relish of salvation in it, then trip him, that his soul may be damned and black as hell whereto it goes." Now, of course, if we were to treat this episode in isolation, then we could accuse Hamlet of immorality or even inhumanity. But we have to remember that not only does Claudius appear to pray, but once Hamlet has left, the king's closing words expose the appearance of the thespian assault on language that it actually is. He says, "My words fly up, my thoughts remain below. Words without thoughts never to heaven go." Restoring the connection then between word, thought, and action is what Hamlet then proceeds to do when he encounters his mother in the following scene. But it's also what he has to do before he can perform any meaningful act that will make sense and that will make public the peculiar nature of the revenge that he's been instructed to take. The reminders that he confronts at various points in the play serve not only to enlarge the definition of the action that he has to perform, but also to give him a sense of his own identity in the larger scheme of things. Hence, the path of revenge leads him through an evaluation of his own being in the face of a bewildering world where deceit, deception, equivocation, and criminality prevail, sometimes under the cloak of matriarchal care or friendship. Action presupposes both the freedom and the will to act, but action also cannot be isolated from a larger context of demands and obligations. In the same way that later in the play, Laertes is the key to a complex definition of revenge, so earlier it's he who makes the important distinction between Hamlet as a free agent and as a prince with very public responsibilities. In Act 1, Scene 3, Laertes says to Ophelia, "His greatness weighed, his will is not his own. He may not, as unvalued persons do, carve for himself, for on his choice depends the safety and defence of the whole state. And therefore must his choice be circumscribed unto the voice and yielding of that body whereof he is the head." Now this all comes together, the public and the private world of Hamlet, in the mysterious voyage to England, where he edits the letter that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are carrying to the English king. The moment's an accident in that his intervention is both fortuitous and unplanned. Later in Act 5, Scene 2, Hamlet is invited to play a duel with Laertes, and he overrides Horatio's suspicion that this may be a trap with an important statement about the operations of Christian providence. He says, "Not a whit. We defy augury. There's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all, since no man of aught he leaves knows what 'tis is to leave betimes." Now, this Protestant revision of the principle of action is important in the play. God provides the opportunities, and the actor needs to be ready to take best advantage of them. For Hamlet, the unity of providence and historical contingency is crucial. In the ensuing action, the regicide is exposed and justice is enacted. And Gertrude drinks poison, in inverted commas, accidentally. She's left to heaven, as the ghost foretold. Now, the tragedy of the play is that the deadly poison that kills his mother and hastens the death of Claudius and Laertes also infects Hamlet, so that the wisdom he has learned dies with him, along with the violence that he's endured and enacted. He is, however, in the brief time that he is de facto ruler, able to nominate his successor, Fortinbras, who in his military exploits bears a striking and unnerving resemblance to old Hamlet, and who has significantly some rights of memory in this kingdom, which now, to claim my vantage, doth invite me. The restoration of memory and the reinstatement of providence as the guiding force of human action, thought and language, and ultimately of justice, comes but at a price, and that price is the loss of Hamlet, who has, of course, been rendered impure by his engagement with the poison that Claudius fabricates. Okay, let me turn to Othello now. And the first thing we have to say about Othello, of course, is that it is not about revenge in the way that Hamlet is. Indeed, in a later play, attention has recently tended to focus on the questions of the representation of gender and race and of controversies surrounding modern casting practices in relation to the figure of the eponymous hero. For some time, Othello was regarded as a domestic tragedy, although, as we've seen in relation to Hamlet, the domestic and the public worlds are closely interwoven. But the closer we look at Othello, the more we can see that the play represents different kinds of revenge, all of which come to focus on the actions and the thoughts of the eponymous hero. Now, in plays such as Othello and later Antony and Cleopatra, more attention is given to the representation of conflicting points of view, and audiences are invited to observe events through a variety of perspectives. In Othello, the divergences are significant, as are indeed the different motivations for action across a range of dramatic personae. The play begins in the middle of a conversation between Rodrigo and Iago. Now, we don't yet know what Rodrigo's deictic "this" refers to. He says, "I take it much unkindly that thou, Iago, who hast my purse, as if the strings were thine, should know of this." As a way of justifying himself, Iago reveals that he's been passed over for promotion in favour of a great arithmetician, one Michael Cassio, a Florentine. Now, this is the first of a number of motives for Iago's secret animosity towards Othello. Iago will follow Othello to serve my turn upon him. And even more, in following him, I follow but myself. Heaven is my judge, not I for love and duty, but seeming so for my peculiar end. For when my outward action doth demonstrate the native act and figure of my heart in compliment extern, 'tis not long after but I will wear my heart upon my sleeve, for doors to peck at. I am not what I am. You can see the echo here of Claudius's duplicity with language coming out in the figure of Iago. Now, Iago's candor here is misleading in that it doesn't occur to Rodrigo to apply what he says to his own situation. Iago's rank is that of an ensign, one who carries the military flag. But this representation is, we might say, skin deep. Later, after having disquieted Brabantio, Desdemona's father, and having bad-mouthed Othello, he departs with the words, "I must show out a flag and sign of life, which is indeed but sign." Iago has a white face, but a black heart. In a Venice where colour symbolism is endowed with moral, political, and ethical value. Iago's resentment, deriving from professional jealousy, fuels a racism that has the capacity to dehumanize the play's eponymous tragic hero. Othello, according to this negative valuation, is an old black ram who is tupping your white ewe, and Brabantio is urged to awake the snorting citizens with the bell, or else the devil will make a grandsire of you. Initially, the bewildered father resists the challenge, but after Rodrigo's reinforcement of Iago's sentiments, he reveals that, quote, "The accident is not unlike my dream. Belief of it oppresses me already." At the heart of Venice, then, is a patriarchal fear of loss that will fuel Iago's revenge against Othello. But it also infects Venice's fantasy life, its dream world. Part of Iago's strategy is that he incites others to act, thereby drawing them into a complex web of fears and motivations in which fantasy and reality collide. There's been much speculation about Iago's motivation since the Romantic poet Samuel Coleridge pronounced that his was a motiveless malignity. The fact is that aside from his initial motivation, which is jealousy of Cassio's professional success and a hostility towards Othello, he adduces others. For example, in the soliloquy in which he reveals his plot to discredit Cassio, in part by imputing motives that will discredit Cassio's dealings with Desdemona, he also discloses other motives. This is what he says in Act 2, Scene 1. He says, "Now I do love her too, not out of absolute lust, though peradventure I stand accountant for as great a sin, but partly led to diet my revenge, for that I do suspect the lusty Moor hath leapt into my seat, the thought whereof doth like a poisonous mineral gnaw at my innards, and nothing can or shall content my soul till I am evened with him, wife for wife." Now, his suspicion also extends to Cassio in this respect. What Iago stimulates in Brabantio, and what he will later provoke in Othello, is a jealousy so strong that judgment cannot cure, that is rooted in the patriarchal loss of possession, whether it be a father's loss of control over his daughter or a husband's loss of control over his wife. In the case of Brabantio, the loss proves to be deadly, but it does not provoke revenge. Similarly, in Cassio's case, the fall from favour is disquieting, but does not produce an irrational backlash. It produces regret, certainly. But in the case of Iago's real target, Othello, the latter is deceived in replicating the contours of his ensign's behaviour. The process is slow, and in the episodes involving Brabantio and Cassio, different facets of Iago's complex net of entrapment that he will later deploy on Othello are revealed. By Act 3, Scene 3, Iago is ready to tackle Othello. The entire strategy is dependent upon Othello's assessment of Iago. "I know thou art full of love and honesty." But it's also dependent upon Iago's assessment of Othello's openness. It's ironical that just as there is a discrepancy between Iago's inner life and the outward signs that he manipulates, so with Othello, the inner man is noble, whereas his black appearance is associated in Venice with the devil. This split in the persona of the tragic hero is there from the beginning, and is part of a larger structure whereby as audience we're forced continuously to process contradictory signs. In Shakespeare's earlier comedy, The Merchant of Venice, a possible misogynistic marriage between Portia and Morocco is summarily rejected, although in that play, generally, the target is the figure of the stranger Shylock, the Jew, whom Venetian law coerces into conformity. Anti-Semitism is one facet of Venice's racist behaviour, and in Othello, a more sustained colour prejudice is its counterpart. In the earlier play, the Jew outlines the similarities between himself and his Venetian adversaries. He says, hath not a due eyes, hath not a due hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If a Jew wrong a Christian, what's his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what's his sufferance? What would his sufferance be by Christian example? Why, revenge. The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. Now, unlike in Hamlet, that interrogates the ethics of revenge, Shakespeare's Venetian plays expose a series of contradictions that reside at the heart of Republican Venice, a state that was popularly thought to dispense with hierarchies and to welcome all strangers. Shylock, like Othello, is a stranger in Venice, and in both cases, their presence releases a virulent anti-Semitism and a racism, both of which emerge as strangers adopt Venice's values. Both Shylock and Othello are hybrid figures, and neither is fully assimilated into Venice's structures, though both are necessary for the Republic's official functioning. Shylock supplies money for Venetian economic enterprise, and Othello is the protector of the state against the barbarian, i.e. against the Turks. In both plays, revenge is a powerful subterranean force that has both a quasi-legal foundation and is capable of generating an illusory form of justice. Shylock's bond is, by his own definition, a form of revenge, though it seeks to avail itself of the law, whereas what Othello does is to usurp the law as the governor of Cyprus on a pretext for which the actual empirical proof is very flimsy. In doing so, Othello enacts the logic of Shylock, but also in doing so, he's motivated by the patriarchal fear of loss of possession that has already afflicted both Brabantio and, in a professional sense, Cassio, and the overwhelming of judgment by emotion that the different contours of this fear elicits. Now, like Brabantio earlier, Othello's reasoning begins from conclusions and is deductive rather than inductive. He begins from the assumption that Iago's love and honesty are genuine, and that therefore his hesitations must point to a deep emotional disturbance that he is reluctant to display openly. This is what Othello says in Act 3, Scene 3. And for I know thou art full of love and honesty, and weigh thy words before thou give them breath. Therefore these stops of thine fright me the more. For such things in a false disloyal knave are tricks of custom, but in a man that's just, they're close dilations working from the heart that passion cannot rule. Now the irony here, of course, is that the dilations to which Othello refers in Iago's case refer to even deeper emotions that collectively violate the very love and honesty to which Othello appeals. Brabantio's much earlier conclusion, emanating from the mere absence of Desdemona, that it is too true and evil gone she is here replicated as Othello is manipulated into a series of conclusions prompted by only the flimsiest kind of circumstantial evidence. And of course, in Brabantio's case, at the point where he says that it is true and evil gone she is, the verse breaks down. The iambic verse breaks down. And later on, of course, when Othello gets to the point of believing that Desdemona is unfaithful, the verse breaks down there too. So it becomes symptomatic of a psychological state. But let's be careful here. Othello's not in any straightforward sense naive. He knows what disloyalty and dishonesty are, and how they reveal themselves rhetorically. He does not, however, suspect his ensign, nor does he have any second thoughts about the initial appointment of Cassio. Indeed, he only regrets that appointment after Cassio appears to disgrace himself in Cyprus. And even then, he doesn't know the full story, since the narrative at this point, as indeed elsewhere in the play, is very carefully manipulated by Iago. Indeed, so audacious is Iago's strategy that he can tell Othello the truth about himself without arousing suspicion. Iago's withholding of his own thoughts is regarded by Othello as a violation of friendship. Thou dost conspire against thy friend Iago, if thou but thinkst him wronged and makest his ear a stranger to thy thoughts. But this is what Iago says by way of response. I do beseech you, though I perchance am vicious in my guess, as I confess it is my nature's plague to spy into abuses, and oft my jealousy shapes faults that are not, that your wisdom, from one that so imperfectly conceits, would take no notice, nor build yourself a trouble out of his scattering and unsure observance. It were not for your quiet, nor for your good, nor for my manhood, honesty, and wisdom, to let you know my thoughts. We can judge Iago's characterization of himself on the basis of the evidence that we as audience have accumulated, but note the context that Iago provides. He admits to jealousy and to fantasizing, but he concludes by repeating Othello's own evaluation of himself. To utter his thoughts would certainly, we know, disquiet Othello, but that to do so would damage his own manhood, honesty, and wisdom is to strengthen the inference that their integrity remains intact. This apparent concern is also proleptic, in that Othello's quiet will be radically disrupted, and his manhood, honesty, and wisdom exposed to scrutiny as he acts upon what he believes to be Iago's display of honesty and friendship. But the question is, what effect does all this have on Othello? Firstly, it makes him susceptible to suggestion, but others have preceded him in this: Rodrigo, Brabantio, and Cassio. Iago's warning replicates exactly his own previously disclosed fears. It says, "Oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster which do mock the meat it feeds on. The cuckold lives in bliss, who, certain of his fate, loves not the wronger. But oh, what damned minutes tells he o'er, who dotes yet doubts, suspects yet strongly loves." Now, it's Othello's openness that provides Iago with the ammunition he needs. But the focus on jealousy and cuckoldry eats deeply into the Venetian patriarchal unconscious, thereby making Othello the inheritor of Brabantio's disquiet. The deception of her father is invoked to establish a much larger pattern of deception that will be used against Desdemona. The protracted assault on Othello's consciousness and judgment provides the context for dealing with the lost handkerchief, the very piece of tangible evidence that will be used to confirm Desdemona's alleged adultery with Cassio. Now, we know the backstory to Iago's obtaining of the handkerchief, and he uses the fabricated claim that it's now in Cassio's possession to strengthen the case against Desdemona. If it be that, or any that was hers, it speaks against her with the other proofs. At this point, we have to remind ourselves that Desdemona has done nothing wrong, morally or legally, and that she's not been involved in any public display that would cast doubt on her integrity or her moral authority. Othello's response, therefore, is private, and he has no formal recourse to the law to upbraid her, or indeed to punish her for her alleged infidelity. Indeed, what we know to be a seriously flawed rational response to Iago's gradual accumulating circumstantial narrative turns out to release a deadly upsurge of emotion that steers Othello to revenge. Oh, that the slave had 40,000 lives. One is too poor, too weak for my revenge. Now I see, 'tis true. Look here, Iago, all my fond love, thus do I blow to heaven. 'Tis gone. Arise, black vengeance, from the hollow hell. Yield up, O love, thy crown and hearted throne to tyrannous hate. Sweet bosom, with thy fraught, for 'tis of aspics' tongues. Beg your pardon, swell bosom, with thy fraught, for 'tis of aspics' tongues. Now, unlike Hamlet, where the nature of revenge is the question that opens up a host of other questions, in Othello, revenge is always and remains private. Iago reveals part of himself to Rodrigo in order to continue milking him of money, but he keeps other aspects of his motivation from all but the audience. Othello's own revenge is secretive, and that he reveals it to no one but Iago. But that revenge is embedded in other forms of classification that are subsumed into the focus on marital infidelity that the protagonist is persuaded to share with the villain. It is indeed the case, as Kim Hall has argued, that both economic and gender concerns are articulated through arbitrary distinctions of colour. She does this in her very fine book, Things of Darkness, Economies of Race and Gender in Early Modern England, 1995. Now, we've seen how economic issues initially filter into Othello's language of love. But Iago's rhetoric expands that discourse to include questions of female promiscuity and deception. Venetian masculine concerns and fear that Othello is persuaded to accept as motivations for his capable and wide revenge. Indeed, humble love, like the ebbing tide, relegated to an inferior status, is a position to which it is now impossible to return. And this leads to Othello's invoking of the indifferent yond marble heaven to cement in the due reverence of a sacred vow his words. Now, in contrast to Hamlet, where the oath to remember and revenge gradually assumes substantive meaning, in Othello, the protagonist's oath has a severely limited contingent value that proves to be an inadequate foundation upon which to build a case. The entire fantasy to which Othello succumbs as he takes over the lurid contours of Brabantio's dream reaches into the heart of a female identity in Venice. In a conversation between the bewildered Desdemona and her serving maid Emilia about the existence of women who do abuse their husbands in such gross kinds, it's the serving woman who offers a perspicacious observation of female subjectivity that matches Shylock's "hath not a Jew eyes" speech in the earlier Merchant of Venice. She says, "But I do think it is their husbands' faults, if wives do fall. Say that they slack their duties and pour our treasures into foreign laps, or else break out in peevish jealousies, throwing restraint upon us, or say they strike us, or scant our former having in despite. Why, we have goals, and though we have some grace, yet we have some revenge. Let husbands know that wives have sense like them. They see, they smell, and have their palates, both for sweet and sour, as husbands have. What is it that they do when they change us for others? Is it sport? I think it is. Is it frailty that does theirs? It is so too. And have we not affections, desires for sport, and frailty as men have? Then let them use us well, else let them know the ills we do, their ills instruct us so." This is an important speech that contextualizes the Venetian patriarchal perception of female subjectivity. In domestic matters, revenge is always contingent and is as much a proclivity in women as in men. What we do not expect to find is that for all its claims to superior rationality, Venetian masculinity is subject to the devastating irrationalities of professional envy, sexual jealousy, and its deadly consequence, revenge. Now, we can see the full force of this irrationality when Othello is brought to the point of exacting revenge against Desdemona. By this time, he's trapped in a web of fantasy that Iago weaves as part of his own revenge. As he approaches the sleeping Desdemona, Othello reflects upon his cause. The cause is one that he cannot name. "Let me not name it to you, you chaste stars," he says. But he's also caught between his negative image of women and the appearance of Desdemona. Her skin is whiter than snow and smooth as monumental alabaster. But she must die, else she'll betray more men. Othello is bought completely into the patriarchal myth of female infidelity, although the context that Amelia has provided for the audience still resonates. He is under no illusion about the magnitude of the act he's about to commit, since it will be irreparable. And he's still caught between Desdemona's appearance and what he believes will be an act of justice in killing her. He says, I know not where is that Promethean heat that can thy light relume. When I've plucked the rose, I cannot give it vital growth again. It must needs wither. I'll smell thee on the tree, O balmy breath that does almost persuade justice to break his sword. Once more, be thus when thou art dead, and I will kill thee and love thee after. And that's the last. Here, Othello's own hybrid identity is projected onto Desdemona, who will now be the victim of a fantasy of justice. The contrast with Hamlet's predicament could not be clearer, insofar as he is charged with restoring justice to a rotten Denmark. Othello's justification is wholly illusory, and he exposes an irrational passion that is now out of control. And yet Othello knows what he's doing, in the same way that he earlier revealed that he knows how to distinguish the gestures of an honest man from those of a false, disloyal knave. But this is a deductive rather than an inductive knowledge. He begins from the belief that Iago is honest, and in this case, that Desdemona is, as a type of Venetian woman, pathologically unfaithful. Up to this point, Othello's own capacity for self-reflection has been partial. He thinks that it's his blackness and his claimed inarticulacy that's caused her alleged infidelity. Although he quickly dismisses these reasons. He says, happily for I am black, and have not those soft parts of conversation that chamberers have, or for I am declined into the vale of years. Yet that's not much. She's gone, I'm abused, and my relief must be to loathe her. O curse of marriage, that we can call these delicate creatures ours, not their appetites. Of course, Othello's powers of persuasion are not lacking, as his narrative of the courtship of Desdemona earlier indicates. The gap between a logic of patriarchal possession and female appetite is prescient, since once he's disabused of his fantasy, he redirects the course of justice to himself. Or to put the matter differently, at the end of the play, Othello is a stranger to himself as he plays out the opposition between Venetian and Turk on his own body. Now, this is an unusual suicide by any Shakespearean standard. We note that Hamlet's killed by the same poison that kills his mother, Laertes and finally Claudius, but his death is unintentional. Indeed, we might say that it's part of a larger providential design that corrects the evil in Denmark while acknowledging that the killing of Claudius taints his executioner. In Othello, just as the dynamics of revenge are different, so Othello's final act of justice displays the impossibility of his dilemma. Conflict between Venetian and Turk, between the noble hero and the black devil, is now located within the dramatic persona of the tragic protagonist himself. This makes of Othello's suicide a peculiar gesture in the direction of a retributive justice. He had thought to enact justice on Desdemona for her alleged infidelity, but like Seneca's Oedipus, he proposes himself as a model of justice whose fate repeated performance reenacts as a kind of Senecan self-torturing. In the fifth act of Seneca's Oedipus, the tragic hero longs for repeated punishment for his crime, whereas in Shakespeare's play, the time, the place, the torture emphasizes that it's the villain Iago whose tongue will be loosened and the performance will begin again. Unlike in Hamlet, where revenge is brought within the aegis of lawful retribution and distinguished clearly from anarchic wild justice, in Othello, revenge is the violent result of a delusion. In the later play, the representative of Venice perverts justice, but tries to reclaim some semblance of nobility by rooting the Turk out of his being. There are no gods here, and no external supernatural forces on whom human behavior or onto whom human behavior can be displaced. But there is something else. The ending of Hamlet has the eponymous hero dying before he can give a full account. Had I but time, he says, as this fell sergeant death is strict in his arrest, oh, I could tell you, but let it be. He tells Horatio to report me and my cause aright to the unsatisfied. But he dies in silence. The rest, he says, is silence. Horatio's account, however, is only partial, and there's a sense in which the theatre audience that have been mutes or audience to this act probably know more than Horatio does. Horatio, remember, he will tell of carnal, bloody, and unnatural acts, of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, of deaths put on by cunning and forced cause, and in this upshot, purposes mistook fallen on the inventors' heads. Well, so far so good. This makes especially tantalizing Hamlet's "Oh, I could tell you." But there is a sense in which, even though the semblance of the play's ending restores a conservative order, that too much has happened to render the ideology that holds it in place fragile. Fortinbras restores honour, but there's a sense in which he is less vulnerable than old Hamlet, even though he shows respect for the past. Hamlet's silence and the deaths in which he's been involved complete an action and bring revenge back into the orbit of justice, where what Horatio regards as accidents are in fact the operations of providence. Now, Othello, on the other hand, ends differently. The murder of Desdemona is wild and cannot really be categorized within the ethos of justice. Othello's final speech, "Soft you a word or two before you go," is not, as the poet T.S. Eliot once thought, an attempt to cheer himself up. It's a report that encompasses fully the division that the tragic hero represents and externalizes. We would be mistaken if we did not think that Othello was not easily jealous, or that he was not perplexed in the extreme. When he enacts justice upon himself, this is not a replication of the example of Oedipus. Rather, he acknowledges a Manichaean split between good and evil, between the badge that for early Jacobean spectators his black face signifies, and the noble representative of Venetian values that Desdemona saw in his mind. At this point, we recall Iago's silence. Iago seeks to enforce others to silence, but when Othello asks him to explain himself, he says this: "Demand me nothing. What you know, you know. From this time forth, I never will speak word." But finally, having been clearly identified as the hellish villain, Iago will now be forced to speak. And it's this punishment that will loosen the villain's tongue. And when he speaks again, we, of course, return to the beginning of the play. The filmmaker Orson Welles, by the way, understood this, since he opened his film of the play with the ending. Now, there's no balance restored at the end of Othello. Both Othello and Desdemona are victims of the patriarchal fantasy that is a crucial part of the Venetian unconscious. Ludovico's response that the object poisons sight is an observation that leaves the ending open. An action in the Aristotelian sense has been completed, but is unsatisfactory, and will always be so long as Venice's human subjects are split. Here, revenge is shown to be inimical to justice, and the noble hero will always be at odds with his physical appearance, and the racism that it triggers will always cast doubt on Venetian claims to welcome strangers. So what we have then, and I'll conclude with this sentence, is two revenge plays that approach the subject in radically different but no less thoughtful ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor DRAKAKIS. I think our audience would be stoked and intrigued by now because they are already beginning with their questions. The points that you brought out with regard to Shakespearean tragedy, especially Hamlet as well as Othello, are quite intricate, and the details that you brought about, especially when you talk about how the verse breakdown actually comes when Othello talks about the unfaithful attribute of his own wife. And with regard to that, there are some questions that I would like to point out right now. And one of them would be, this may sound a bit putrid because this is something that is a very much talked about and debated question that is found in many literary circles that I have found myself in. And the basic thing is Shakespeare is actually a very cultural icon in this particular generation, and there are many interpretations as to who Shakespeare actually is. There are some wild speculations as to who he actually is. Is he really a man, or was he a spy, or was he exactly Marlowe who actually disguised himself as Shakespeare? And there are so many different speculations that surrounds such a mysterious writer. And can you give us a solution, or can you give us a definitive picture of the man or the writer Shakespeare actually was?
Very, very difficult. It's a very difficult question. Sir Stanley Wells recently gave a lecture on, I think it was his 90th birthday, something like this, to say who Shakespeare was. And in his description, he ended up virtually saying that Shakespeare was very much like Sir Stanley Wells. And this is always the problem. Critics tend to project onto Shakespeare the things that they like to think they are famous for. Shakespeare was obviously a very good actor in that, he disguised whatever he was. What little we know of his private life, we know he was a landowner. We know he got involved in lawsuits and all the rest of it. We know he wanted to buy, a coat of arms. We know that he invested money. Now, what does that make him in the late Elizabethan, early Jacobean context? Well, it's very, very difficult, I think. Because there's so much about Shakespeare that we don't know. One of the things we don't know, we don't know, for example, basic things. We don't know how he read, right? Now, we assume, of course, because when we read silently. Yes? We sit down with a book in silence and we don't move our lips at all. There's no guarantee that that's the way that Shakespeare read. And there's no guarantee that many Elizabethans read like that. They read sometimes communally. That's to say, they read to each other. So all of these links that critics make between Shakespeare and, let's say, earlier published books presuppose that Shakespeare had access to a massive library for which there is no evidence whatsoever. And so we have to rethink things like that. He was a man of the theatre, certainly. And he was obviously fascinated. And the two plays I've chosen to discuss today emphasize this. He was very much concerned with the idea of acting and the ways in which acting impinge upon questions of integrity, matters of truth. And of course, these are issues which, in the wake of the demise of Donald Trump in America, and the idea of false news, fake truth, we question those notions of truth. Whereas, of course, in Elizabethan and early Jacobean England, this would have been very controversial. And if Donald Trump had been transported into 16th century England, he would have been regarded as a very, very dangerous person indeed, right? In fact, he would have looked like Machiavel, the prologue to Marlowe's The Jew of Malta. I weigh not men, and therefore not men's words. We're so used to the relative sort of sense of truth, really. You have your truth, I have my truth. We might be able to agree on certain sorts of basic truth, But nonetheless, there's enough to suggest that there is a relativity. And there are people, of course, who are scrupulous enough in the modern world to take advantage of that. And of course, the postmodernity presupposes that there is no grand narrative. There is no one narrative that encompasses everything. Depends on, what position you take up. Now, Shakespeare, I think, is at an early stage of that investigation. And he's clearly intelligent enough to recognize the pitfalls involved. Both Othello and Hamlet deal with this question of the precariousness of language. And also, of course, with the possible deceptions that appearance is open to. So, in a sense, I'm kind of refusing to answer your question because I don't think there is an answer to it, or there isn't one that we can be satisfied with. Would we, if we bumped into Shakespeare in the street, be able to recognize him? My fantasy is that if I were talking, if you were William Shakespeare and you and I were having a conversation, he wouldn't understand a word of what I'm saying. We inhabit different universes. And of course, what we do is we take these texts over, we adapt them, we appropriate them, we reinterpret them. And the fact that these texts allow us to do that, and the fact that these texts continue in a way to allow us to speak to our own culture through the work of a dramatist writing 450 years ago, that's important, I think. That's why he's become a cultural icon. And the iconicity is important here.
Wonderful answer, sir. I think by now interpretations and all interpretations have just been defined as mere fantasies, and that's just
well, I don't want to go that far. So at what extreme interpretation is fantasy? And you can see how this works in a play like Othello.
Right.
Where there is, there is a certain fantasy. But no, interpretations vary. We can look at the same text and we can come to different conclusions. And we then derive, this is what, the practice of literary criticism is all about. What we do is we derive conclusions from the empirical evidence of the text as we see it. As I think, Terry Eagleton, very eminent literary critic, said, King Lear is not about Leeds United. Perhaps I need to explain Leeds United. Leeds United used to be a famous football team. And because it's gone down, people have substituted, King Lear is not about Manchester United. Well, no, it isn't. It's not about a football club, and it's not about a football game. It's about something else.
So, but interpretations have become a very crucial part when you're studying Shakespeare or when you're reading Shakespeare, because the current generation are never free from such interpretations when they're getting introduced to Shakespeare's texts. But it only makes us wonder if we happen to remove all those interpretations from our focus, and if we happen to take in Shakespeare's dramas, especially his tragedies, on a much more fresh note. If we are one of those people who are sitting in the podium when the drama is actually being played in front of an audience for the first time, would that lack of interpretation from the 20th century or from the 19th century bring down the excitement or the effect of the dramas that were produced by Shakespeare? Is there any possibility, sir?
Oh, again, that's a difficult question, because there's a sense in which, for example, we come to Hamlet, even if we've never read Hamlet, even if we've never seen Hamlet. It's so ubiquitous in our culture across the world that, if you ask somebody who Hamlet is, then they may give you a fairly basic idea. He's asked to revenge himself for the death of his father, and he can't do it. No, in a way, that's kind of correct. I mean, it just so happens that, you know, we have accumulated 450 years of commentary. Now, of course, if you want to go back to, you know, to the original, what you would need to do is to look at an original quarto of the play. Yeah. So you would need to look at how the Elizabethans might have, encountered the play. And I think that, you know, for somebody who's never read a 16th century quarto, it really does, it's an eye-opener, because the punctuation's all wrong. You know, there are capital letters where there shouldn't be. There are variant spellings where there are, you know, where there shouldn't be. None of the things that we take for granted when we read a text. We like to think of a text as being a kind of transparent window into the world of the author. You couldn't possibly do that with a 16th century published version of Shakespeare. And of course, in the case of Hamlet, you've got 3 separate texts. Which one do you choose? I mean, this is the sort of thing that editors, the question that editors have to ask. So, I mean, the idea of some kind of pure engagement with Shakespeare, that in itself is a fantasy, because an actor, a modern actor, playing a Shakespearean role brings the training of modern acting to the business of representing the text. Now, we're not sure even what the gestures of an Elizabethan actor would have been. You know, we have no surviving. There's no, you know, videotape or film or DVD of an Elizabethan actor actually strutting his stuff on the stage. So we have to build this up empirically. I mean, when was it? B.L. Joseph's book, 1952. He got hold of a 16th century deaf and dumb manual with all the gestures, and suggests that these are the gestures that that actors would have used. And people like Alan Desson, who investigate this, go right through the text, and they try to excavate gestures that they would think of as being the kinds of gestures that an Elizabethan actor would use. But it's all circumstantial and very, very difficult to prove.
Great. A wonderful answer, sir. And I think questions from my side are over. And now some of the questions from our YouTube viewers will be met with now. And we have a question from Bojan Bosley, and he asks, what makes Hamlet different from other contemporary works?
What makes Hamlet different from? Well, the more contemporary works that you read, that's how we encounter them, the more you realize that Shakespeare is using the same kinds of materials and that he's actually innovating on them. You know, I mean, what we have in a revenge tragedy is a pattern is established, a pattern of behavior involving particular elements, as I've tried to outline in my lecture. And what Shakespeare does is to take them and he develops them. Now, perhaps a good modern example would be the way in which in film, particular directors take a certain tradition and then innovate on them. I mean, the one my favorite, of course, is the Sergio Leone Westerns with Clint Eastwood. Do you know those? Yeah. Fistful of dollars, a few dollars more, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Right? Thanks, and Once Upon a Time in the West. And basically what happens here, of course, is the tradition of the Western is that the hero wears a white hat, rides a white horse, you know, and he's always on the side of good.
He has no name.
And of course, and has a name, of course, this is it. And the thing about the Dollars Westerns is that the hero has no name, that he's almost as vicious as the villains. In fact, he's an anti-hero. And my favorite is the second one, which is a few dollars more, where it's a revenge Western, basically, where the Lee Van Cleef character is seeking revenge on a Mexican bandit for shooting his sister. And of course, we don't go into too much detail about the relationship between him and his sister. We suspect it's incestuous, and of course, so his job is to kill the bandit. Whereas, of course, the anti-hero is a bounty hunter. So he just sees bandits as, a sort of cash register. And at the end, we have Lee Van Cleef riding off into the sunset. He's not wearing a white hat. He's wearing a black hat. So that's questionable, right? And it's romantic. And then, of course, you have the anti-hero who has a cart and he's piling up the bodies on the cart. And he comes to a certain point and he's missing a body. And he hears a rustle behind him, turns around, shoots him, and then puts the body on the cart. And the hero says, "Are you okay, son?" And to which he says, "Yes, I was just having a little problem with my arithmetic." And he gets onto the cart and he rides off into the sunset with all these bodies. Now, you can't deal with that unless you understand what the tradition of the Western is. And, Shakespeare is in a way the kind of Sergio Leone of his day. I mean, what he does is he takes the tradition of the Western, of the revenge play, and he innovates on it. So, if you have madness, well, how do you deal with that? We know what the traditional view is, that the hero goes mad and he does some crazy things. Whereas here, of course, you have a character, Hamlet is disturbed. I mean, yes, his world has been shaken, but he pretends to be mad. And what Shakespeare then does is say, okay, well, let's have madness in this particular play, but we'll displace it onto Ophelia. So we'll find out, what madness, how madness is produced. Well, madness is produced by having literally the bottom of her world taken out. Her father's killed. She's rejected by the person that she's planned to marry. And she commits suicide. She dies in ambiguous circumstances. Hamlet uses madness as a cover. Ophelia, of course, has no alternative. She just goes mad. But that idea of separating it from the hero, displacing it onto the female, which is quite interesting, says something about, the perception of femininity, of female subjectivity at this particular point. But yet, of course, it's Shakespeare who is innovating here. Which is not to say that other dramatists don't innovate as well. Have a look at Webster's The White Devil and the Duchess of Malfi. Webster's an extremely innovative dramatist. Have a look at Cyril Turner's The Atheist's Tragedy, which again is a very peculiar play. Or have a look at, we now think that it may be Thomas Middleton who wrote The Revenger's Tragedy. It used to be ascribed to Cyril Turner. Have a look at that and see, what happens to the tradition in this extraordinarily surrealistic play. So, that's what Shakespeare does with a tradition that by, the end of the 16th century has already quickly been established. And of course, he's used it before, where he hasn't innovated. He doesn't innovate in Titus Andronicus. He simply copies, but it's an early investigation, as it were. He comes back to it. And this is what Shakespeare does all the time. He goes back to earlier work, revises it, rethinks it.
So Shakespeare can be seen as a person who re-innovates the genre as well as the mode of writing. Spectacular answer, sir. And we have another answer from another question from Anusha Hegde, and she asks, in his quest to exact his revenge in The Tempest, Prospero constructs love between Rosalind and Ferdinand. Was she robbed of her agency to choose her husband?
Not Rosalind in The Tempest. It's what's her name? Gosh, I've forgotten her name now. I was thinking of Tyra Wilcox, because Tyra Wilcox was an actress who played the role in The Tempest. Where's my copy of The Tempest? Yeah. Anyway, it's not Rosalind. But again, be careful with this one. I mean, Elizabethan culture has problems with, female agency in that respect. Usually it was fathers who had control over daughters. And there's a very kind of ambiguous way of dealing with this. Because on the one hand, you want to give your daughter the freedom to choose, but on the other hand, you reserve the right to control her choice. I mean, if you look at The Merchant of Venice, Portia's choice is circumscribed by her father's, by her father's will. And he's dead, of course, so he operates from beyond the grave. And the reason he does so is because, the female of the species is claimed to be, guilty of unrestrained promiscuity, therefore has to be controlled. Okay, this is one of the myths that feminists have had a hell of a job dealing with, because on the one hand they want freedom for women, but on the other hand they find themselves constrained by that patriarchal fantasy of female anarchy. So in a sense, Prospero is within his rights. Of course, it's not only his daughter that he controls, is it? He controls everybody in that particular play, including Ariel and Caliban. So, no, I don't think she's robbed of female agency. There's a sense in which she is encouraged to form a relationship with Ferdinand, but it has to go according to the conventions of the period. But what you find, of course, in various commentaries on male-female relations is that the woman is becoming more and more important within the framework of the household. She's the one who organizes the household. She might be the one who handles the domestic finances and things of that kind. And so there is this idea growing, as it were, of what we think of as the companionate marriage. One of the questions you might want to ask yourself is, how does Shakespeare deal with the fact that he spends a lot of time away from Stratford? Yeah. We normally think of, married couples as spending time together, and it's a penalty if they don't. You've got cultures where that kind of companionate marriage doesn't operate. It's a very bourgeois way of looking at things. Shakespeare spends as much time away in London as he does in Stratford. Now he manages to father how many? 4 children? So, but I think be careful with this, because there again, we can project our own values onto these plays, and I think we have to allow for that. And we have to allow for the reasons. Well, we won't agree with them. Of course we don't. My goodness me. If my daughters thought that I had to control their choices, they would go berserk. They wouldn't let me out alive.
Wonderful answer to such a wonderful question, sir. So we have this another question from Raj. If Shakespeare was alive today, how would he have reacted to the pandemic? Did Shakespeare go through a pandemic during his lifetime?
Second part of the question first, yes, he did, because of course there were numerous plagues in London, and once that plague deaths in London had reached, I think it was, there's some doubt about this, either 30 or 40 a week, the theatres were closed. In other words, all the public spaces would be closed because, of course, the fear of spreading. I mean, he tended to be much more draconian, I think, than, should we say, somebody like Boris Johnson, who can't make up his mind what he wants to do, and who's really split between, you know, economics on the one hand and business and public health on the other. And he's trying to square that circle. Not an easy one to square, of course, in modern culture. I think the Elizabethan, they'd be much more ruthless. And bear in mind, what is life expectancy in the Western world now? Well, of course, it depends very much on what your social class is. I mean, the present pandemic has, it has hit elderly people, basically. I mean, I'd be classed as elderly. I'd have been dead 20 years ago if I'd lived in the Elizabethan period. Shakespeare died at the age of 52, and he was an old man. You know, Queen Elizabeth died at the age of 70, but she was well protected. You know, we've just celebrated the death of this Captain Sir Tom, I should say, who died at the age of 100. And we believe in longevity. So we're always looking for ways to extend human life, ways of being healthy and all the rest of it. I mean, they didn't have vaccines in the 16th century. So, you know, if you caught one of these diseases, then the chances are that you would die. You know, the population was much smaller. They weren't as healthy, I would say, by comparison. We have all sorts of, you know, medical means of keeping people healthy and all the rest of it. So if Shakespeare were alive today, he would be baffled. You know, I mean, he would wonder why governments are being so mealy-mouthed about it, you know. I mean, good God, 100,000 deaths, 112,000 deaths in Britain, you know. And his response would be, close everything. Stop the circulation. Now you tell politicians that, and of course they don't want to know.
Wonderful, sir. So we have this another question from Vivek Raj, and he asks, why revenge is so common in most of Shakespeare's works?
Why is revenge so common? Well, I think the thing is, it is a problem of law in many respects. I mean, you know, you've got this kind of aristocratic notion of if somebody insults you, then you seek immediate redress, and it's personal. Now, you know, as the law is becoming more and more sophisticated, you know, as lawyers are emerging, and of course there are lots of trials and lots of lawyers in plays, so of course revenge becomes a kind of personal challenge. I mean, you notice in most of these revenge plays, Othello is a rather special kind of revenge. But in most of the plays that we think of as revenge plays, it's when, you know, actions get out of hand, or when somebody does something that has repercussions, and those repercussions exceed the capacity of the law to deal with them. Now, that's, I think, the difference. As we are emerging, you know, from a culture which is still a very militaristic culture in many ways, and where violence was much more the norm, I think, than it is now. I mean, although there are plenty of revenges that take place, we tend to think that this is part and parcel of the criminal community. I mean, you think of the number of mafia films that are concerned with revenges. The Godfather films, for example, they're all concerned with revenge for something that's done, retribution for whatever. And of course, it's all done outside the law. The law really is nowhere to be seen there. The only time we see the law in The Godfather is when it's corrupt. Yeah. And that's always a very real problem. And if you look at modern sort of detective series, you find that frequently it's about the corruption of the law, or it's about someone who takes the law into their own hands. I mean, there's a very, very good series called Law and Order Special Victims Unit. And it's a lot of rapes in it, So I mean, you think that everybody's raping everybody else in the United States if you look at this. And of course, the conclusions, the solutions, they're already finding the solutions. But it's the interesting thing when you've got a father whose daughter has been raped, and why he doesn't, of course, he gets all of them, And then, of course, you've got the law, which is, well, look, let us handle this. We'll get it, And the father is saying things like, well, no, you're not doing anything. You're not trying to find my daughter's rapist, etc. And that's the kind of thing. It's a crisis of law in lots of ways, and it's a crisis of order. Now, on top of that, of course, if you take the line that Linda Woodbridge takes in her book on economics and revenge tragedy, that somehow it's a way of settling accounts and a way of, if you like, making a profit on a particular transaction, where of course the transaction here is killing somebody for something that they've done to you.
Well said, sir. And we have this one final YouTube viewer with her question, and that is, why is there a delay in Hamlet's act of revenge?
Why is the delay? Yeah. It's an interesting one, and it's one of those innovative moments, okay? Now, you can argue that in the established tradition of revenge, delay is because the revenger can find no way of exacting revenge. Now, in Hamlet's case, it's not just the fact that he can't find a way of exacting revenge. It's just that he can't even formulate the concept of revenge, because the very means with which you would expect to be able to formulate it, that is to say, through language, through a narrative, these things are undermined by Claudius, right? Everything Claudius says is a lie. Everything he says points up the division between reality and language. And this is why figures like Laertes are important, because they offer us an insight into what happens. If you want to become a real revenger, you have to throw everything out of the window. It's a recipe for chaos, right? And, what are these? Antiquity forgot, says Laertes, custom not known, the ratifiers and props of every word, right? In other words, there are institutions that are specifically designed to underpin language. You attack language, you attack those institutions. And here is Hamlet faced with institutions in crisis, and he has to act. Now, if he acts immediately, well, there are two things. First of all, if he acts immediately, we have the shortest Elizabethan revenge play on record. Okay, so let's discount that. Also, if he acts immediately, he can himself be accused of regicide. Why? because, of course, there's nobody accusing Claudius at all. In fact, Claudius takes everybody in Act 1, Scene 2, where he spends 14 lines, the first 14 lines of his speech, though yet of Hamlet, our dear brother's death, the memory be green, etc., and that it us befitted to bear our hearts in one contracted, yet so far hath discretion fought with nature that we with wise at sorrow think on him together with remembrance. And he talks about with one auspicious and one dropping eye. Now, I challenge anybody to do that with their eyes. Can you cry with one eye and open it wide with the other at the same time? Can you?
I don't think it's possible.
I don't think it's possible. But the thing is, it's rhetorically very powerful. If you don't ask about whether it's possible or not, you can be persuaded, right? And then at the end of all this, he says, nor have we herein barred your better wisdoms, which have freely gone with us along, for all much thanks. What does the villain do? He literally incorporates everybody into himself. He claims that it's their decision, nor have we herein barred your better wisdoms. And the only outsider there is Hamlet. He's not persuaded, right? Now, the thing is, he's already aware that there is something rotten in the stake in Denmark. The problem is to find out exactly what it is and to verify what the ghost has said. And it's not until the end of the play that Claudius's guilt is public. It's Laertes who says, the king's to blame. And at that particular point, what Claudius says is, oh, help me, friends, I am but hurt. Now, if you're thinking of blocking the scenes, in Act 1, Scene 2, Hamlet is on the outside. Everybody else is in a group. At the end, Claudius is on the outside, and everybody else is in the group, right? And it's only when you get to that point that you realize that Hamlet could not have acted before that. And indeed, when he does act, the act's a rash. He kills Polonius. It's a rash act. He mistakes Polonius for Claudius. So again, you have to be very careful here. And it's only when he comes to realize that he has to take the opportunity when the opportunity is offered. Right? There is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow. Something as insignificant as a sparrow falling out of the sky is planned by God's providence. And so you have to be ready. So the readiness is all. And then you have to act. And that's what happens, of course, in Act 5. It's only when the opportunity presents itself, which is as a result of Claudius's own skullduggery, that he exposes himself. He doesn't expose himself in the mousetrap scene, because although Hamlet can read his gesture as a gesture of guilt, nobody else does. Gertrude doesn't even see the connection between the lady in the mousetrap and herself. What think you of this play, madam? The lady doth protest too much, methinks. It doesn't touch her at all. And it's only in the closet scene that Hamlet has then got the task of telling his mother what she's done. And at the end of it, she actually says, "O Hamlet, thou turn'st mine eyes into my very soul, and I see there such deep and grained spots as will not leave their tinct." And of course, she still doesn't quite get it, because the ghost comes into the scene and gives Hamlet a finger wagging, but she doesn't see the ghost. So she's still in a situation where she doesn't fully recognize, her position. And it's only she gravitates towards Hamlet, and it's only at the end that she's in that group with Hamlet. And of course, that Claudius is out on the margins. So, if you look closely in the play, you'll find there are very good reasons why that revenge doesn't happen immediately.
This is entirely a new interpretation of Hamlet's procrastination as leading to something fruitful in the end, because we find that everyone apart from Hamlet is also realizing the fact that Claudius is actually the villain in this entire story.
Sure.
After an hour-long lecture that was spectacular with so many intricate details, I think we found so many different things that we have not learned before. We have saw how interpretations actually could shape up a different perspective when you are looking at Shakespeare and his dramas. Before giving this segment a closing, I would just like to make a request from Littriel and as well as all our audience who are watching us right now. During your lecture, we have seen how you had made a very dramatic reading of the text. And hence, we would like to request you if you could just give us a quote from any of Shakespeare's dramas or any scene from Shakespeare's drama that you find much more impressive or that is very much to your own liking. Any line or any scene.
It's a bit like saying, what's your favorite Shakespeare play? There are plays that I keep on coming back to. I mean, I've lived with The Merchant of Venice for a very long time. So in a sense, it would be a bit unfair. Hamlet, I keep coming back to. Othello, I keep coming back to. Another play I keep on coming back to is Much Ado About Nothing, of the comedies. Largely because I think there's a lot going on there. And I'm much more interested in the silences in that play. And there's one character there who says absolutely nothing. And yet her name appears only in 2 scenes at the scene headings. Editors always edit her out. Her name is Imogen. And she doesn't say a word. But in my reading of the play, she is there as, if you like, a challenge to this masculine ethos of the play, which is to shut the woman up. You remember that the most loquacious woman is Beatrice. And at the end of the first quarto, it's Hero's father who says, "Peace, I will stop your mouth." In the folio, Benedict kisses Beatrice, stopping her from speaking. And of course, that's the position to which Imogen is relegated as the wife of Leonato. And she's there right the way throughout. And it's my argument that she has to be there in the church scene where Claudio rejects Hero. And of course, she doesn't say anything, but her facial expressions, need to be seen. There's only one production of the play that keeps Imogen in. I've never seen it. It was too expensive. They wanted £100 and something for a ticket down in London. I wasn't going to pay that much, but I didn't hear very much about it either. But I think it is. So, it's a silence that interests me. I have a soft spot for Hotspur in Henry IV, Part 1, and particularly for his death speech. "O Harry, thou hast robbed me of my youth. I better brook the loss of brittle life than those proud titles you have won from me. They wound my thoughts as thy sword does wound my flesh. But time that must take survey of all the world must have a stop. Oh, I could prophesy, but that the cold and earthy hand of death lies on my tongue. No, Harry, thou art and food for," and he dies. And Hal says, "For worms, brave Percy." No, it's a wonderful. I once played the part of Hotspur. It's a wonderful part. In a school play, but no, I mean, Richard III's opening speech. Now is the winter of our discontent. Make glorious summer by the sun of York, etc., etc. It's a wonderful speech, and it's utterly audacious. But yeah, I wake up one morning, I think of one thing. Next morning, I wake up and think of something else. That's the advantage of Shakespeare. You can always find something.
We had such a tremendous experience with this episode of the Expert Library, and we offer our thanks from all of us at Litrial, and we had an amazing time with you, sir. And to our audience, stay tuned for the coming episodes and coming segments of our official YouTube channel, Litrial Broadcast. And until the next episode of the Expert Library, thank you all and have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you.